Her brother called me the one she compares everyone to. Then he went very quiet, as if he had just heard himself say something he had not intended to say out loud. I remember the exact sound of the fork he set down on the table. I remember thinking, that sentence requires a conversation. I also remember thinking, I am not ready for that conversation. I was wrong about the second part. My name is Daniel Marsh. I am 34. I do geotechnical surveying, soil testing, ground assessments, the kind of work that takes you to construction sites at 6 in the morning and leaves you with permanently dusty boots. I live in a flat above a bakery on Calder Street, which means I wake up to the smell of bread every day, which sounds idyllic until you have tried sleeping past 7 on a Saturday. I had lived there for 2 years before I met Rowan Adeyemi. I had lived there for 2 years and 1 month before I understood that my life had quietly organized itself around her presence without asking my permission. Rowan was 31. She ran a small ceramic studio 2 floors above me. A converted storeroom she had somehow persuaded the landlord to rent cheaply by telling him it had damp. It did not have damp. She had good instincts about negotiation and bad instincts about hiding the fact that she had good instincts about negotiation. She had a habit of carrying a small sketchbook with a red elastic strap that she had replaced so many times the cover was worn pale at the corners. She never showed anyone what was in it. I had been trying for 8 months to be the kind of person who didn't want to know. We met because I had the wrong key. Not metaphorically. I had been given the wrong key by a building manager who clearly considered accuracy optional, and I spent 45 minutes trying to get into what I thought was my flat before Rowan opened her door, looked at me with the expression of someone who had been listening to this for longer than she found reasonable, and said, "That's not your door. That's my door. Your door is the gray one." I looked at the gray door. I looked at my key. I looked at her. She handed me a cup of tea. She had clearly made 2, and said, "You look like you need to sit down for a moment." I did. I did need to sit down for a moment. I sat down. I stayed for 3 hours. I left having understood that I was in significant trouble. The dynamic between us was neighbors who had graduated to something more than that without either of us formally upgrading the label. We watched films through the shared wall. She would text me what she was putting on. I would put on the same thing, and we would occasionally knock on the shared plasterwork when something happened that required a reaction. We had coffee on the landing on Sunday mornings. We corrected each other's grammar in text messages, which is the kind of intimacy people don't talk about, but which is, in my experience, more revealing than most things. What we did not do was say anything true about any of it. We had built a structure that looked, from any reasonable distance, like a very comfortable friendship. We both knew what it was. Neither of us said so. What I told myself was, she needs someone reliable, not someone who wants something from her. What she told herself, I would find out later, was considerably more instructive. The first crack appeared on a Thursday evening in November, when the boiler in the building went out. The kind of failure that announces itself at 9 at night, when the temperature has already dropped below what anyone considers reasonable for a flat with single glazing. Rowan knocked on my door wearing a coat she had put on over her studio clothes, which meant she had paint on her left cuff, a piece of dried clay on her wrist, and the very particular expression of a person who has already assessed the situation and has a proposal. "I have a better duvet," she said, "and a thermos. Your flat is colder than mine." I asked how she knew how cold my flat was. She said she could tell from the drought under the shared wall when I left my window open. Then, she looked at the floor for half a second too long and added, "I've been aware of it for a while." That was the first sentence that sat differently. I stood in my doorway and made a decision I would later recognize as the most reasonable thing I had managed all year. I said, "Yes, fine, come in." She came in. She put the thermos on my kitchen counter and sat down on my sofa and took off her coat, and I noticed she was wearing the gray jumper she always wore when she was cold, which I noticed because I had been paying very close attention to Rowan Adeyemi for 8 months. I blamed the situation on the cold. This was not the most credible attribution I had ever made. We talked about her current commission, a set of exhibition pieces she was behind on, a glaze technique that was giving her problems. I told her about a site assessment I had done that week where I had found ground conditions that should not technically have been possible given the geological survey. She asked questions. The questions were good. They were the questions of someone who had been listening to me talk about my work for long enough to have an opinion about it. I noticed that too. I notice most things where Rowan is concerned. I have begun to accept this as a permanent feature of my situation rather than a temporary inconvenience. Somewhere around 11 o'clock, she said, "Do you ever think about how long we've been doing this?" I asked what she meant by this. She looked at the wall. She looked back at me. She said, "I don't know. The films. The coffee. The thing where I apparently know when your window is open." She picked up her mug. She held it with both hands and did not drink from it. "I don't know why I'm asking," I said. "I think about it." She nodded once. Slowly, the way she nodded when something confirmed a suspicion she had already held. Then, she got up and put on her coat and said good night and went back to her flat. I sat on my sofa for a while afterward and tried to do something useful with what had just happened. I was not successful. The dinner with her brother came 3 weeks later. His name was Marcus. He was 28. He was funnier than anyone had warned me. And he had, I would discover, absolutely no interest in maintaining social fictions he found unnecessary. He had come to visit for the weekend, and Rowan had suggested, in what I now understood was a text message of studied casualness, that we all have dinner in her flat on Friday night. I said yes because I always said yes when Rowan asked me something. I have poor instincts about protecting my own equilibrium where she is concerned. This is not new information. Marcus arrived with wine and the energy of someone who had already heard a great deal about me and was interested in the discrepancy between the account and the reality. He shook my hand at the door. He looked at me with the particular attention of a younger sibling who has been paying close attention to a recurring character in a long-running story. He said, "Oh, so you're the one who fixed the window latch?" I said that I was. "Yes," he nodded in the way of a person confirming a detail. Dinner was easy. Marcus was easy. He had Rowan's habit of asking specific questions, and her quality of listening to the answers as if they genuinely interested him, which I suspected in both cases they genuinely did. We talked about his architecture course. We talked about the ceramics show Rowan had coming up, which she was nervous about in the way she was nervous about things, not visibly, just slightly faster in her responses and more precise in her self-corrections. I watched her across the table. I told myself I was just checking she was all right. It was over the plates, when she had gone to make coffee, that Marcus leaned back in his chair and looked at me the way he had been looking at me intermittently all evening, appraising, good-humored, curious, and said, "She talks about you, you know, more than she talks about most people." I said something inadequate. I said something like, "We're neighbors, it makes sense." Marcus smiled the smile of someone who is choosing not to challenge something directly. He picked up his glass. He said, almost to himself, "She compares people to you. New people she meets. I don't think she realizes she does it." He paused. Then he said, quieter, as if the volume of it might reduce the weight, You're the one she compares everyone to." Then he went very quiet. The silence was the particular kind that follows a sentence which has said more than the speaker intended. I watched him understand, slowly, that he had handed me something. He did not take it back. He looked at the table. He picked up his fork and set it down again. Rowan came back with the coffee and looked at the two of us. She looked at her brother's expression. She looked at mine. She said, very carefully, "What did I miss?" Marcus said, "Nothing." He said it the way a person says nothing when they mean something significant, and I'm leaving it where it landed. She knocked on my door at 11:15 that night. I had been sitting with a book I had not read a single sentence of. I opened the door. She was wearing the gray jumper again. She had the sketchbook in her hand, held against her side with the red elastic strap, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who had been sitting on a decision for a while and had finally reached the point where sitting on it was no longer working. I opened the door wider. I said, "Come in." She came in. She stood in my kitchen and did not sit down. She looked at the counter. She said, "Marcus told you something." I said it was more of an observation. She said, "I know what he observes. I know what he would have said." She set the sketchbook on the counter with slightly too much care. He's not wrong. The air in the room did something it had not done before. She said, "I have compared people to you. I didn't realize how often until he said it back to me just now, after you left, and I sat there and tried to argue with it and couldn't." She looked at me. "That's not a comfortable thing to find out about yourself." I said, "You don't have to keep going." She said, "I know." She did not stop. "I know I don't have to. I want to." She looked at the sketchbook. She looked back at me. "I kept the wrong film on one night. 3 months ago, you'd texted me a different one. And I didn't tell you because I wanted to see if you'd notice." She paused. "You noticed. You knocked twice, which was the signal for something wrong with the film, and I went and put the right one on, and I sat there for about 20 minutes thinking about what it meant that you knew." She looked at me steadily. "I've thought about it most days since." I went very still. I said, "You could have just told me you got it wrong." She said, "I know that. I didn't want to." She breathed in. "I wanted you to catch it." Something in my understanding of the past 8 months quietly rearranged itself. All of it. The Sunday coffees that always ran longer than they should. The way she corrected my grammar in text messages at 11 at night. The 2 cups of tea on the day I had the wrong key. I said, "The tea. The first day. You'd already made 2. She said, "You took 45 minutes with that door. I heard you come up the stairs, the smallest real smile, the one she didn't perform." I made 2 cups at the 20-minute mark. I stood very still. I was attempting to determine whether my understanding of the English language had suddenly become unreliable, or whether Rowan Adeyemi had just informed me, using a series of statements about tea and film times, that she had been making room for me, specifically, since the beginning. I said, "I have thought about what this is for a long time. I have been very careful not to assume." She said, "I know you have." I said, "I would like to stop being careful. If you." She said, "Yes." She said it simply, clearly, the way she said things she was certain of. I took 1 step across my kitchen. She did not move back. I put my hand over hers on the counter, gently, and she turned her hand over and held it. We stood in my kitchen at 11:20 at night, and I thought about all the Sundays on the landing, all the films through the wall, all the times I had called something a friendship rather than name the thing it actually was. I thought about her brother's face when he'd realized what he'd said and gone quiet. Then her phone alarm went off. She had set it for midnight. She looked at the phone. She looked at me. She said, "I have a reminder to email the gallery about the installation schedule." She looked at the alarm. She did not turn it off immediately. "That can wait until tomorrow." She silenced it. She stayed. 6 weeks later, she showed me the sketchbook. She handed it to me on a Sunday morning on the landing with both our coffees steaming in the cold, and said, "You can look. You've been very polite about not asking." I turned the first page. There were drawings, quick, detailed, the kind of drawings that meant someone had been looking closely. Studies of the building, the hallway, the gray door, my boots on the landing mat, which I had not realized she had ever noticed. I turned 2 more pages. I stopped. She said, "That one's from about 4 months in." It was a drawing of the landing at night, rough and fast and accurate, with the light from under my door visible in the corner. Just that. Just the light under the door. I said, "Rowan." She said, "I know." She took the sketchbook back and held it with both hands. I told myself it was a compositional study. She looked at me sideways. It was not a compositional study. I did not have words available to me that were sufficient. I said what I had. I told her. Every good piece of news, every difficult sight, every morning I'd walked past her door, she was the first thing I thought about. Not strategically, just automatically. The way you think about something that has already become necessary. She looked at me for a moment with the expression I had been cataloging for 8 months, but could now read correctly. Then she said, "You're going to be very smug about the tea, aren't you?" I said I was going to be smug about the tea for the foreseeable future. She laughed. The real one. Months on from that, when the ceramics show opened and Marcus came back down for it and stood next to me in the gallery looking at the exhibition pieces, all clean lines and heavy silence and something that moved in the light, he said, quietly, and without looking at me, "I'm glad I said it." I said, "So am I." Years later, when people ask how it started, Rowan tells it as a story about a wrong key and too much stubbornness, and a cup of tea that was waiting before it was needed. She leaves out the part about the sketchbook. She leaves out the part where she set the wrong film on purpose and waited to see if I'd catch it. Those are the things she keeps, I think, because they belong only to the moment before anything was said, and she has never been someone who gives away the whole inventory. What I tell people when they ask is simpler. I say she made room for it first. I just had to notice. Nothing had appeared from nowhere. It had simply stopped being ignored. What would you have done if someone close to her let something slip like that, and then went quiet? And have you ever realized, too late, that you were comparing everyone to one specific person without knowing you were doing it? Leave your answer in the comments. If this one stayed with you, a like and a subscribe means I'll keep making them, and I'll see you in the next one.